The Sleepless Princess. The palace of the Sci-Fi Empire was built of dark crystal, floating in the sky like a lonely star. It shone brightly, but inside, it was silent, too silent. No laughter, no music, no joy. There was only the quiet whisper of servants walking carefully, afraid to make a sound. At the heart of the palace, inside a grand chamber with golden pillars and walls covered in glowing symbols, sat Princess Syra. She had not slept in years. Her deep violet eyes were tired, but she did not close them. She could not. If she closed her eyes, her body would shake, her mind would burn, and shadows would creep into her thoughts. She was the daughter of Emperor Varkan, ruler of the great Sci-Fi Empire. A warrior race, proud and powerful, they had conquered planets, fought great battles, and built cities among the stars. But even the strongest warriors could not fight the curse. No Sci-Fi could truly rest. They could sit, they could meditate, but sleep, the deep, healing sleep that humans had, was impossible. And Princess Syra, the heir to the throne, suffered the most. The empire's best doctors, mystics, and scientists had all failed. The greatest minds searched for a cure, but none could find one. No potion, no machine, no technology could bring her peace. The emperor grew desperate. He sent a message across the galaxy. Whoever can make my daughter sleep shall receive riches beyond imagination. Thousands came, doctors from distant worlds, alien mystics, even strange creatures with glowing hands that claimed to hold the secrets of the universe. But one by one, they failed. Until one day, a human arrived. His name was John Carter. He was not a scientist, not a doctor, not a magician. He was just a man, a mercenary, a soldier for hire, someone who had seen too many battles and carried too many scars. He walked into the grand chamber without fear. Unlike the others, he did not bow deeply or tremble before the emperor. He only gave a small nod, his sharp blue eyes studying the room. The royal guards did not like him. He looked too simple, too rough. His clothes were not made of silk or metal, but of strong earth fabric. He carried no magic, only a blaster at his hip and an old knife on his belt. The emperor sat upon his high throne, his golden armor gleaming. His voice was deep and heavy with authority. "Are you a healer, human?" John smirked. "No." The crowd gasped at his bluntness. The Sci-Fi were a proud race. No one spoke so casually to their ruler. The emperor's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you here?" John glanced at Princess Syra. She was sitting in her chair, her back straight, her expression calm. But he saw the truth. Her hands trembled. Her breathing was too controlled, too forced. Her eyes, though sharp, held the weight of exhaustion that no one should bear. John spoke again, his voice steady. "I heard about the problem. Thought I'd try something different." The royal advisor, an old alien with silver skin, scoffed. "The greatest minds in the galaxy have failed. What can a human do?" John shrugged. "I don't know. But I know humans sleep just fine. Maybe we do something different." Princess Syra looked at him carefully. For years, she had seen only doctors, scientists, and desperate men with wild ideas. But this human was different. He did not look at her with pity or with fear. He simply looked, curious. The emperor's expression was unreadable. He had lost hope long ago, but something about this man, this simple human, made him pause. After a moment, he waved his hand. "Very well. You may try. But if you waste my time, you will not leave this palace alive." John did not flinch. Fair enough. That night, John was brought to the princess's chamber. The room was beautiful but empty. It had no warmth, no comfort, only cold furniture and dark walls. John frowned. No blankets, no soft pillows. The royal attendant, a tall alien with glowing green skin, looked confused. "The princess does not need such things." John sighed. "Yeah, I can see that." He walked over to Syra, who sat on a raised bed made of smooth crystal. "Tell me," he said, "have you ever heard a bedtime story?" Zaira raised an eyebrow. "A what?" John chuckled. "Figures." He pulled a chair close to her bed and leaned back. "All right, princess. I'm gonna tell you a story. Just listen." Zaira hesitated. No one had ever spoken to her this way before. But something about this human made her curious. She did not stop him. And so, John began to tell an old Earth story. A simple story. A story about a lonely traveler, a warm fire, and the sound of rain outside. As he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, rhythmic. Not rushed, not anxious, just peaceful. For the first time in years, Tyra's hands stopped shaking. For the first time in years, she blinked slowly. Her breathing became lighter. Her body relaxed just a little. John kept talking, his voice like a quiet wave in the distance. Then, something shocking happened. For a brief moment, her eyes began to close. The attendants gasped. The guards took a step forward. Zaira's eyelids fluttered, just for a second. But then, suddenly, she jerked awake. Her body tensed. Her heart pounded. Her hands clenched the blanket. Panic filled her eyes. "No," she whispered. "Something is wrong." John frowned. "What do you mean?" Zaira's voice trembled. I felt something strange." "And what was that?" John asked. Zaira swallowed hard, her eyes full of confusion and fear. "I felt safe." The human solution. Princess Zaira sat frozen on the edge of her bed, her hands gripping the silk sheets. Her heart was racing. She had not felt anything like this in years. John Carter leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. He had seen that look before, the look of a soldier who had spent too many nights waiting for an attack that never came. "I don't understand," Kyra whispered. "It was only for a second, but I felt safe." John nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's kind of the point." The room was still. The royal attendants, the guards, even the old advisor in the corner. Everyone was watching. They had witnessed something impossible. The princess, who had not slept for years, had almost drifted into unconsciousness. And the cause of it? A human. The emperor's advisor, a tall alien with 4 arms and silver skin, stepped forward. His glowing eyes narrowed at John. "What trick is this? Some earth sorcery? A hidden device?" John scoffed. "Yeah, sure. I carry a magic sleep ray in my pocket. Want me to use it on you next?" The advisor's lip curled in disgust. "Do not mock our intelligence, human." John ignored him and turned back to Zaira. "What usually happens when you try to sleep?" Zaira hesitated. No one had ever asked her this before, not in this way. "I feel the weight of the room. The silence. My body grows heavier, and my thoughts race. I remember things I wish I could forget. My muscles lock. My heart pounds as if danger is near." And then, she looked down, ashamed. "I wake up before I ever truly sleep." John nodded again, as if this made perfect sense. "Hypervigilance," he muttered. The advisor folded his arms. "Speak plainly, human." John sighed. "She's stuck in survival mode. It's a condition we have on Earth too. Soldiers, refugees, people who go through too much. They can't turn it off. Their brain won't let them rest, because it thinks danger is always near." The Seraphi looked at each other. Their race was one of warriors and conquerors. They were trained from birth to be alert, sharp, and merciless. But they had never seen this as a curse before. John continued, "Humans are different. We fight, we survive, but at the end of the day, we need to sleep. Otherwise, we go crazy. We've learned ways to shut down, even in the worst situations." Zaira's tired eyes studied him. "And how do you do that?" John smirked. "Well, princess, I'm guessing your fancy empire never tried bedtime stories, warm drinks, and a friend nearby." A murmur of confusion spread through the room. The emperor himself stepped forward. His presence was immense, his golden robes shimmering like the sun. "You are saying," the emperor's deep voice echoed, "that a mere story could succeed where my greatest minds have failed?" John shrugged. "Worked for every human kid on Earth." The advisor scoffed. "Absurd." John ignored him and stood up. He walked to the princess's bedside, stopping just close enough for her to hear his voice clearly. "Close your eyes," he said. She stiffened. "Just for a second," he added. "No pressure. Just breathe." Zaira hesitated. The air in the room was heavy. She had been ordered by doctors, by scholars, by warriors, but never had anyone ask her. Slowly, she closed her eyes. John spoke, his voice steady. "Imagine a small cabin, deep in the woods. There's a fire inside, warm and safe. Outside, it's raining, but inside, you're dry. The fire crackles, the sound of the rain taps against the roof, soft and distant." Zaira exhaled. Her fingers, clenched tight against the sheets, loosened slightly. John continued. "The chair you sit in is soft. The air is warm. You hold a cup of something sweet, steam rising from it. You listen to the rain, the fire, the distant hoot of an owl. And nothing else. No danger. No war. Just peace." Her breathing slowed. The room was dead silent. Every eye was locked on the princess. John watched carefully. "Good. Now open your eyes." Zaira did. For the first time in years, her hands were still. The emperor stepped forward, his face unreadable. "What just happened?" John shrugged. "I gave her something her mind forgot how to recognize. Safety." The room erupted in whispers. The Seraphi did not believe in safety. They lived for battle, for power. To them, fear was a tool. And yet, in that moment, the princess had tasted something else, something she had longed for. The advisor scoffed again. "This means nothing. It is a trick, a moment of distraction. The princess still cannot sleep." John exhaled. "Yeah, I figured as much. This won't be instant. She spent her whole life in a world that tells her to stay awake. It's gonna take more than one story to fix that." He turned to the emperor. "I'll need to stay." The guards instantly raised their weapons. John didn't flinch, not forever. Just for a while. "Let me try something." The emperor's golden eyes burned into him. "And what is it you wish to try, human?" John smirked. "Simple. I'm gonna do what no one else in this empire has done before." The emperor raised an eyebrow. "And that is?" John leaned against the nearest pillar, arms crossed. "I'm gonna sleep in the same room as your daughter." A dangerous discovery. The emperor's golden eyes narrowed as silence filled the chamber. Every Seraphi in the room held their breath. Had a human really just demanded to sleep in the same room as the princess? John Carter stood firm. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable. He wasn't challenging them, not directly, but he wasn't backing down either. The royal guards moved first. Their dark armor glistened as they stepped forward, their weapons humming with energy. One false move, and John would be turned to dust. The emperor slowly rose from his throne, the power in his presence pressing against the air itself. He towered over John, his deep voice shaking the chamber. "Explain yourself, human." John stayed calm. He had seen this before, the way leaders used presence alone to command a room. He had served under warlords, kings, and generals. He knew one thing about power. It was all about control. And right now, the emperor was losing control. John met his gaze. "Your daughter doesn't need another scientist poking at her. She doesn't need another magic ritual or some alien tech strapped to her head." He took a step forward. "She needs something she's never had before, a real sense of security." The emperor's jaw clenched. "And you believe you can provide that?" John smirked. "I don't believe it. I know it." A sharp inhale spread through the room. No one spoke to the emperor like this. No one had ever dared. Princess Zyra sat still, her tired violet eyes locked on John. She wasn't sure whether to be angry or impressed. The Emperor took a long breath, his gaze flicking to his daughter. "Zyra," he said, "what do you say?" Every head turned toward her. She hesitated. For years she had been told what to do, how to act, what was expected of her. She had tried every cure, every method, every desperate hope that someone had offered. And yet, nothing had ever made her feel the way she had felt in that brief moment when John had spoken to her. That brief moment where her hands had stopped shaking. She swallowed and looked at her father. "I wish to try." The Emperor's face hardened. The room tensed. Then, slowly, he sat back down. "Very well." Nightfall in the princess's chamber. The Seraphim palace was quieter than usual. The news had spread fast. The human would be sleeping in the princess's chamber. The idea was scandalous. Some called it an insult. Others called it madness. But no one dared to question the Emperor's decision. At least, not openly. Inside the chamber, John stretched his arms and let out a yawn. "This place is way too fancy," he muttered. He eyed the tall, golden bed made of some alien crystal. No pillows, no blankets, just a hard, shimmering surface. He shook his head. "No wonder you can't sleep, princess. This thing looks like a coffin." Zyra raised an eyebrow. "Seraphim warriors do not require softness." John smirked. "Right, because being miserable is a sign of strength." He turned to one of the palace servants. "Hey, you got any actual pillows? Maybe a real blanket?" The servant blinked. "A blanket?" John nodded. "Yeah, you know. Soft thing, keeps you warm." The servant looked confused but hurried off to find something. Zyra studied John carefully. He was different. Every doctor who had come before had treated her like a puzzle to solve. Every mystic had whispered strange words and looked at her with pity. But John treated her like a person. A strange, reckless, and annoying person, but a person. He dragged a chair over and plopped down, resting his boots on the floor. He leaned back, hands behind his head. "So, what's the usual nighttime routine?" he asked. "Or do you just stare at the ceiling and hope for the best?" Zyra hesitated. "I meditate. I listen to the quiet. I try to empty my mind." John chuckled. "Yeah, see, that's your first mistake. That's like trying to win a fight by doing nothing." She frowned. "Then what would you suggest, human?" John smirked. "Something better." He gestured toward the bed. "Lie down." Zyra hesitated. This was strange. But she did as he asked. "Close your eyes," he said. She did. John's voice dropped to a calm, steady rhythm. "Imagine you're somewhere else, somewhere peaceful, a place with no expectations, no rules. Just you and the sound of something steady, like waves hitting the shore, or a heartbeat." Her breathing slowed. She wasn't aware of it, but John could see the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. "Now focus on my voice," he said, "because here's the thing, princess, you're not alone tonight." Zyra's fingers twitched. "Sleep isn't just about being tired," he continued. "It's about trust. And for the first time in your life, you're not in a room full of people who expect something from you. You're in a room with someone who doesn't give a damn about your title." Silence. Then, a small exhale. John glanced at her face. Her hands weren't shaking. She wasn't asleep, not yet, but she was closer than she had ever been. And then, the lights flickered. John tensed. His instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. Zyra's eyes snapped open. What was that? Before John could answer, the power in the palace died. The golden lights vanished. The energy walls flickered and shut down. The quiet hum of technology stopped. Then, the door to the chamber burst open. Figures in dark cloaks rushed in, moving like shadows. John was on his feet in an instant, hand on his blaster. "Assassins," Zyra whispered, her voice full of shock. John's eyes narrowed. Someone didn't want this experiment to work. He drew his weapon and stepped in front of her. "Princess," he muttered, "you might want to get behind me." Thyra, for the first time in her life, did exactly that. The assassins moved fast. Too fast. John grinned. "Good," he said, raising his blaster. "I was getting bored." The assassins strike. The palace chamber plunged into darkness. The shimmering gold walls, once bright with energy, were now swallowed in shadow. Only the eerie glow of the seraphim moon leaked through the high windows, casting long, distorted figures across the walls. John Carter stood in front of Princess Thyra, his stance relaxed but ready. His blaster was drawn, its barrel humming with deadly energy. Across the room, dark-cloaked assassins moved like liquid shadows, too quiet, too fast. Thyra sucked in a sharp breath. How did they get past the palace defenses? John didn't look at her. His eyes tracked the movement in the darkness. Good question. Maybe ask them when we're done. Thyra felt something she hadn't expected. Fear, not because she was helpless, but because, for the first time, she wasn't alone. And she didn't want to lose the one person who had made her feel safe. The assassins struck first. One lunged, its body blurring through the air, an energy blade flashing in the darkness. John dodged, fast and precise. His human reflexes kicked in. A roll, a pivot, a clean shot. His blaster flared blue, and one assassin crumpled. A hole burned through its chest. The others did not hesitate. 3 more attacked at once. John fired twice. 1 down, 2 still moving. A blade hissed through the air. John twisted, barely avoiding a strike aimed for his throat. His attacker was fast, unnaturally so. Seraphim speed. His gut clenched. These weren't just any assassins. They were royal elite. This wasn't some random attack. This was an inside job. Someone powerful wanted the princess dead. Or maybe they wanted him gone. The human warrior. John moved like a predator. He didn't just fight. He flowed. Every dodge, every strike was efficient, almost effortless. Thyra had never seen anyone fight like this before. Seraphim warriors were brutal. They overwhelmed their enemies with speed and raw strength. Their combat was relentless, aggressive, dominant. But John waited. He didn't waste movement. He let his enemies make mistakes. He let them overextend. He read them. And when they did, he struck. One assassin overcommitted. John sidestepped and slammed his elbow into their throat. The figure choked, falling backward. Another went for his legs. John dropped low, grabbed the attacker's arm, and twisted. A sharp crack echoed in the chamber. The assassin screamed. 1 left. The final assassin hesitated, eyes darting between John and the fallen bodies of their comrades. John exhaled, his blaster still warm in his grip. "You can run," he said, voice calm, "or you can die. Your call." The assassin hesitated for only a second, then vanished into the darkness. John didn't bother chasing. He had bigger problems. The Emperor's wrath. The palace guards stormed in minutes later, too late to do anything but clean up the mess. The Emperor arrived in a fury. His golden robes flowed behind him like fire, his gaze burning with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice shook the walls. John wiped a smear of blood off his lip. "Looks like someone sent killers after your daughter." The Emperor's fists clenched. His gaze snapped to his advisors, then to the fallen assassins. Eyes were filled with something dangerous. He knew. John saw it immediately. The Emperor already knew who was responsible. Thyra stepped forward, her voice firm. These were royal assassins. That means someone inside the palace ordered this. The Emperor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. John didn't miss that. He turned to Thyra. "They weren't here for you." She frowned. "What?" John holstered his blaster. "They had plenty of chances to kill you. They didn't. They waited." Thyra's eyes widened. You're saying they were after you. John gave a lopsided grin. I tend to piss people off. The Emperor's gaze snapped to John. Who would want you dead, human? John let the silence stretch before answering. Whoever doesn't want the princess to sleep. The chamber turned ice cold. That was the truth, wasn't it? Zira had been sleepless for years. Every attempt at a cure had failed. But then a human arrived. And in one night, he had done something no Seraphim had ever done. He had made her feel safe. And someone powerful, didn't want that. A forbidden truth. The Emperor ordered the bodies removed. The tension in the room remained thick, unspoken words pressing against the silence. Finally, Ira spoke. If what John says is true, then we must ask, why? Who benefits from keeping the Seraphim sleepless? The Emperor's face darkened. His golden eyes flickered with something old, something hidden. For the first time, he looked afraid. John caught it. His instincts screamed. Yeah, he muttered, stepping forward. That's a real good question, isn't it? The Emperor exhaled. Then, with slow, careful steps, he approached John. He studied him, measured him. Then he spoke. You are not like the others, human. John raised an eyebrow. Yeah, I get that a lot. The Emperor's gaze hardened. I should have you executed. John grinned. But you won't. The Emperor's fists tightened. Why not? John held his ground. Because I'm the only one who can make your daughter sleep. Silence. The Emperor's jaw ticked. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit. But before leaving, he stopped at the door. His voice was quiet. You do not know what you are meddling with, human. John tilted his head. Then why don't you tell me? The Emperor said nothing. And then, he was gone. Zira turned to John, her face pale. That was strange. John exhaled. No, princess. That was a warning. Zira's throat tightened. You think he knows something? John ran a hand through his hair. Oh, he definitely knows something. He turned toward her, his blue eyes sharp and knowing. And I'm starting to think this sleepless curse of yours. It's not a curse at all. The curse of the Seraphim. The palace was no longer the same. After the assassination attempt, the air was thick with suspicion. Guards lined the hallways. Servants whispered behind their hands. Advisors moved like shadows, their voices hushed and cautious. But John Carter wasn't interested in the paranoia. He was interested in the truth. A dangerous question. John sat on the edge of the princess's luxurious crystal bed, his boots tapping against the floor. Across from him, Zira sat straight, her violet eyes sharp. The tension between them was heavy. Finally, she spoke. You think my father is hiding something? John leaned back, resting his hands behind his head. Oh, he's definitely hiding something. Zira's jaw tightened. He is the Emperor. He carries the weight of an empire. He cannot. John cut her off. Princess, let's skip the royal loyalty speech. His eyes locked onto hers. You know I'm right. She exhaled sharply but said nothing. John stood and began pacing. The timing doesn't add up. Your people have been sleepless for generations. They've ruled, conquered, dominated. And suddenly, the first time you get close to sleep, an attempt is made on your life. Zira swallowed. The realization sent a chill down her spine. John continued. It wasn't random. Someone needs you to stay awake. Someone benefits from it. Zira frowned. That makes no sense. Who would want to keep the Seraphim weak? John turned to her. Weak or controllable? She blinked. What? John leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. Your people are warriors, right? Strong, fearless, brutal. Zira nodded. Yes. John smirked. Then why does your father rule them through fear? Zira's breath caught. It was a question she had never dared to ask. Her father was the greatest emperor in Seraphim history, unchallenged, untouchable. He ruled with absolute authority. And suddenly, John's words made her see something she had never considered before. The Seraphi were warriors, but warriors needed rest. Warriors needed trust. Yet, for generations, her people had been sleepless, restless, filled with tension and paranoia. They never trusted anyone. John's voice was calm, but his words were sharp. If your people could sleep again, what would change? Zyra hesitated. They would feel safe. John nodded. And if they felt safe, would they still need a ruler who kept them afraid? The silence was heavy. Zyra's throat tightened. You're saying, my father is keeping us sleepless on purpose. John met her eyes. I'm saying it's worth asking. She shook her head, her hands clenching into fists. No, that's impossible. The curse was placed upon us long ago by an ancient enemy. John tilted his head. And who told you that? Zyra flinched. The Emperor. Her own words sent a shiver through her. For the first time in her life, doubt crept in. John sighed. Look, I get it. You love your father. You believe in him. But trust me, when you spend enough time around powerful people, you learn one thing real fast. Zyra hesitated. What's that? John's blue eyes were cold. The more powerful they are, the bigger the lies they tell. The forbidden archives. Zyra had access to every part of the palace, except one. The Grand Archives. It was the most heavily restricted place in the empire. Ancient records, lost knowledge, and classified history were stored there. Only the Emperor and his inner circle were allowed entry. Tonight, Zyra was going to break that rule. She and John moved silently through the darkened corridors, cloaks pulled tight. The palace guards were on high alert, but Zyra knew every hidden path, every secret route. John followed her lead, stepping lightly. I can't believe I'm sneaking into an alien library. Zyra shot him a look. This is dangerous, human. John grinned. Danger's kinda my thing. Finally, they reached the massive black door that led to the archives. It was carved from an unbreakable metal, marked with glowing golden symbols of the royal family. Zyra placed her hand on the scanner. The door hummed. Access denied. John sighed. Figures. Zyra clenched her jaw. My father restricted my access. John smirked. Good thing humans are great at breaking into places we don't belong. He pulled a small device from his belt, a human-made hacking tool. Zyra blinked. Where did you get that? John grinned. I borrow things. He placed the device on the scanner. Sparks flickered. A moment later, the door clicked open. Zyra's heart pounded. They stepped inside. The truth no one was meant to see. The Grand Archives were endless. Towers of glowing data tablets stretched into the shadows. Ancient scrolls floated in anti-gravity fields, untouched for centuries. John whistled. You guys really like your books. Zyra ignored him and moved to the nearest terminal. Her fingers danced over the controls, searching. She typed one word. Sleep. Files appeared. Locked. Classified. Restricted. Her heart pounded. She accessed another. And another. Finally, she found one that wasn't locked. She opened it. A holographic recording played. An ancient Seraphi scientist appeared, his face weary. His voice echoed through the room. This will be my final report before my execution. The Emperor has ordered the truth erased. But if you are hearing this, know this. There was never a curse. Zyra's breath hitched. John's fists clenched. Son of a... The scientist's voice shook. The Seraphi were genetically altered long ago, but not by an enemy. Our own rulers did this to us. They took our ability to sleep because it made us easier to control. A restless mind does not question authority. A sleepless warrior does not rebel. Zyra's entire world collapsed. Her father, her people, her suffering. It was all a lie. John exhaled. Well, damn. Zaira stepped back, her hands trembling. This can't be real. But she knew it was. She had lived it. And suddenly, everything made sense. John's voice was quiet. So what now, princess? Zaira took a deep, steady breath. She wasn't a broken girl anymore. She wasn't just the emperor's daughter. She was something more. Her violet eyes burned with something new. Rage. Resolve. She turned to John, her voice cold and sharp. Now, we end this lie. The betrayal and the battle. The truth had shattered everything. Princess Zaira stood in the darkened Grand Archives, her breath unsteady, her pulse hammering, her whole life a lie. The sleepless suffering of her people wasn't a curse from an ancient enemy. It was designed, a system put in place by her own ancestors, a method of control. She gritted her teeth. Her father knew. Her father had always known. John Carter stood beside her, watching her carefully. He had seen this moment before, not with aliens, but with humans. The exact moment when someone woke up. The moment they realized they had been living under someone else's thumb their whole life. Zaira took a deep, shaky breath. Then she turned to John, her violet eyes blazing. We have to expose this. John smirked. That's the spirit. She turned back to the archive's glowing records. If we can bring this to the people, if they see the truth, they won't accept this anymore. John's grin faded slightly. Yeah, there's just one problem with that. Zaira frowned. What? John tilted his head toward the entrance. Zaira followed his gaze. And her heart dropped. The doors to the archives had opened. A squad of royal guardians stood in the doorway, their golden armor gleaming under the archive's pale light. Their weapons were drawn, their eyes cold. And at the front of them, Emperor Varkan, her father. His face was like stone, his golden eyes unreadable. But Zaira knew that expression. She had seen it countless times before. The expression of a man who would not allow disobedience. Zaira forced herself to stand tall, even as her mind screamed, Father. The Emperor's voice was calm, almost quiet. Daughter, step away from the records. She didn't move. John sighed. Yeah, see, that's not gonna happen. The Emperor's eyes flicked to him. Human, you do not understand the weight of your actions. John smirked. Buddy, I never understand the weight of my actions. The royal guardians tensed. A silent order. A warning. Zaira clenched her fists. You knew. You knew this entire time. The Emperor exhaled, as if tired. Of course I knew. A cold chill ran through Zaira's veins. He wasn't even denying it. John whistled. Wow. You're not even trying to make up a good excuse. The Emperor ignored him. He stepped forward, his towering presence filling the room. His voice was absolute. You are my daughter. You will obey. Walk away from this. Zaira shook her head, her throat tightening. No. The Emperor's expression did not change. Then you leave me no choice. The royal guardians rushed forward. John moved first. The battle of the Grand Archives. Everything exploded into chaos. John fired first. His blaster shot lit up the dark room, striking one of the royal guardians in the chest. The impact sent them crashing into a tower of data tablets, blue energy crackling through their armor. Another guardian lunged at John with a plasma blade. John ducked, twisted, and smashed the barrel of his blaster into the attacker's face. The soldier reeled back, and John followed with a brutal elbow to the throat. Zaira wasn't a bystander. She was Seraphi royalty. She had been trained in combat since childhood. 2 guards charged her at once. She dodged, spun, and struck. Her blade cut across one's leg, sending them to the floor. The second aimed for her neck. She caught their wrist, twisted, and sent them crashing into the ground. But there were too many. John gritted his teeth, dodging another strike. I count at least 12. You got a plan, princess. Zaira's breath was sharp, her muscles burning. Keep fighting. John grinned. Love that plan. He blasted another attacker, then ducked just as a spear of energy barely missed his head. Zira moved like lightning, her blade spinning in perfect arcs. But for every guard she struck down, more took their place. And then, the Emperor moved. Zira barely saw him before it was too late. He was fast, inhumanly fast. 1 second, he was standing by the doorway. The next, he was in front of her. She barely had time to react. His hand closed around her throat. Zira choked. The strength of him, overwhelming. His grip like steel. The room blurred around her as he lifted her effortlessly into the air. John saw it and cursed. He fired 3 direct shots to the Emperor's chest. Nothing. The Emperor barely flinched. John's stomach dropped. What the hell kind of monster was this guy? The Emperor's voice was like thunder. You are my daughter. His golden eyes burned. But you are not my heir. Zira struggled, gasping for air. She had fought hundreds of warriors before. She had never felt power like this. The Emperor turned his gaze toward John. And you, human, you should have stayed in your own world. John did not hesitate. He did the only thing he could. He charged. The human challenge. John tackled the Emperor. It was like hitting a wall of solid iron. The impact barely made the Emperor stumble, but it was enough. His grip on Syra loosened. She sucked in a ragged breath and kicked out. Her boot slammed into her father's ribs. It didn't hurt him, but it gave her a chance to break free. She hit the ground, coughing, as John yanked her up. New plan, princess, he muttered. Run. She didn't argue. They bolted. John fired behind them, forcing the royal guardians to dive for cover. Syra moved fast, leading the way through the endless rows of data tablets. Alarms blared. The Emperor's voice echoed through the halls. You cannot run from me. John and Syra burst out of the archives and into the open corridors of the palace. Guards everywhere. Zyra's mind raced. They couldn't fight the entire palace army, but she knew somewhere they could go. She grabbed John's arm. This way. They ran. Through corridors, down hidden paths, past confused soldiers. John's heart pounded. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for her people, for the truth. Finally, Zyra skidded to a stop before a massive, reinforced door. She slammed her palm against the scanner. The doors hissed open. They ran inside. The doors locked behind them. John exhaled. Where the hell are we? Zyra turned to him, her face pale but determined. Her violet eyes burned. The war chambers. John frowned. For what? Zyra's hands curled into fists. For revolution. The human who changed a civilization. The war chambers were ancient. Massive stone walls, carved with the battle history of the Sci-Fi Empire, towered around John Carter and Princess Syra. War banners, their fabric untouched by time, hung from the ceiling. A giant holographic map flickered in the center of the room, displaying the vast star systems under the Emperor's rule. John exhaled, rolling his shoulders. All right, princess. You dragged me into your secret war room. What's the plan? Zyra's violet eyes were sharp, but fire burned within them. There is only one way to defeat my father, she said. We must take this fight to the people. John arched an eyebrow. You think the people are ready to rise up against the guy who's kept them in line for centuries? Zyra placed her hands on the war table, her fingers trembling slightly. They don't know the truth yet. But once they do, she looked up at him. I believe they will choose freedom. John smirked. Yeah, or they'll choose to stay asleep, literally and figuratively. Zyra clenched her fists. They are not weak. John sighed. I'm not saying they are, but they've been conditioned for generations to fear change. You need more than just the truth. You need a symbol, someone to rally behind. Zyra took a deep breath. Then I will be that symbol. John studied her. The tired, sleepless princess was gone. In her place stood a leader. Yeah, he could work with that. But before he could say anything, the doors shook. Boom! John and Syra spun as the reinforced doors shuddered. The Emperor's voice echoed through the halls outside. "You cannot hide from me." John muttered, "Man, this guy does not give up." Syra activated the holographic console. "There's a way out. An emergency passage." John raised an eyebrow. "For escaping." Syra glanced at him. "For strategic retreat." John grinned. "Oh, now we're talking." She entered the code. A hidden panel on the far wall slid open, revealing a dark tunnel. John nodded. "Let's move." They dashed inside as the doors behind them exploded. The call to revolution. The hidden tunnel led them deep beneath the palace, through old catacombs that hadn't been touched in centuries. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing. At the end of the tunnel, they emerged in the middle of the capital city. John looked up. Towering structures of glowing crystal loomed above them. Airships hovered in the sky. Thousands of Seraphi moved through the streets, their faces hardened, restless, sleepless. He muttered, "Yeah, these people are ready for a revolution." Syra took a deep breath. "We need to show them the truth." John grinned. "Lucky for you, I know how to make an entrance." They moved quickly, pushing through the crowds, heading toward the central broadcast tower. The tallest structure in the city, where the Emperor's speeches were transmitted across the empire. John reached into his gear and pulled out a small device. Syra frowned. "What's that?" John smirked. "Something I borrowed. A signal override." Syra's eyes widened. "You planned for this?" John shrugged. "I planned for a lot of things." They reached the tower. Guards patrolled the entrance. John tapped his blaster. "I could shoot our way in." Syra shook her head. "Too risky. We need to do this without bloodshed." John sighed. "Fine. We do it your way." They moved through the shadows, slipping past the guards. Inside the tower, they found the main control room. Syra activated the broadcasting console. John plugged in the override. A holographic screen blinked to life. Across the entire empire, every citizen's holoscreen flickered. And suddenly, the princess appeared before them. Her face was calm, steady. "My people," she said, her voice carrying across planets, across cities, across warships and colonies. "For years, we have suffered. For years, we have been told our sleepless nights are the result of an ancient curse. That we must endure it. That our suffering makes us stronger. But that was a lie." The streets stilled. People froze. Syra continued, her voice unwavering. "Our sleeplessness was designed. Our ancestors were altered, not by an enemy, but by our own rulers. They took away our rest. They kept us awake to keep us weak." Murmurs rose in the streets. Disbelief. Confusion. Rage. Syra's eyes hardened. They feared that if we knew peace, we would no longer fear them. John watched the screen, his pulse steady. He could see it happening, the shift. The people were listening. Then Syra did something bold. She turned to John. "This human, John Carter, discovered the truth, and because of him, I know something I never knew before." She met the eyes of her people. "We can sleep again." The city erupted. The broadcast cut out. The final stand. Alarms blared across the capital. The Emperor had seen everything. Syra and John turned. The palace army was already marching toward them. John exhaled. "Welp." That pissed him off. Syra clenched her fists. "Good." The streets boiled with movement. The Seraphi people weren't running away. They were gathering. They had seen the truth, and they had chosen a side. The revolution had begun. The Emperor himself arrived at the battlefield, golden armor gleaming, fury in his eyes. Syra stepped forward, standing tall. "No more, father," she said. You cannot control us anymore." The emperor lifted his blade. "Then I will rule by force." John stepped beside Syra. His blaster hummed. "Yeah," he said, smirking. "See, that's the thing about humans." The emperor frowned. John grinned. "We don't like tyrants." The battle for the Sci-Fi Empire began. The dawn of a new era. The fight was long. But in the end, the people won. The emperor fell. His reign ended. For the first time in generations, the Sci-Fi people slept. And when they awoke, they were free. Zyra was crowned empress, not a ruler of fear, but a leader chosen by her people. And John, he stood at her side, watching as an empire rebuilt itself. One night, as they looked over the sleeping capital, Thyra turned to him. "Will you stay?" John smirked. "Well, princess, someone's got to make sure you get a good night's sleep." She smiled. And for the first time in her life, she closed her eyes, and she slept.